Hey folks, welcome to live on Friday on YouTube on the Verge Permaculture channel. Today we're going to be talking about permaculture and diet part 2. It's a continuation of the initial conversation that we were having I think almost 3 weeks ago now. So I'm going to go through a quick review on what it is that we spoke about, and then we're going to go live. I'm not sure why my channel is showing the wrong video here. I'm just going to just give me 2 seconds here as I get to the right YouTube video there. If you're just signing in right now, introduce yourself and let me know where you're coming from. I'm curious if you've watched the first part of this series. Today it's just going to be me. Last time it was both Dakota and I talking about this subject. It's a pretty controversial subject, and so I want to make sure that I set the stage right from the beginning in terms of etiquette on the chat window. We didn't have an issue last time, but sometimes we can get very heated debates when it comes to diet and what's right and what's wrong. We all have our beliefs around what's right and wrong, and the purpose of this conversation is to have a scientific conversation about diet. So I feel as though, and I've had this conversation with a lot of my colleagues, that there's a lot at stake with regards to diet. I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer. I traveled around the world specifically trying to find solutions to the energy problems that we had. But the deeper I dug into energy, what I realized was that the most important energy resource that we have to think about is how we currently eat. We do it 3 times a day. And if we don't get it right, and if we don't understand what's at stake, the whole planet is basically in the balance. And right now, I've noticed a number of incredibly incorrect statements, articles, and even changes in the way that some of the most famous people in society are eating. And they're making these massive shifts in their diet, and they're claiming that they're doing this in order to stop climate change or in order to stop various other environmental disasters. Some of them are for ethical reasons. And every time I read these, they make no sense to me. They're lacking in substance, they're lacking in science, they're lacking in anything real, to be honest. And so at the heart of when somebody changes their diet, what I've noticed is that their heart is usually in the right place. And people that are willing to adjust their diet in order to benefit either themselves or the planet around them, I think have incredibly large hearts. And so they're in the right place. But generally speaking, these changes in the way that they eat are not necessarily based in the most sound science. And so my purpose for having this conversation was to enlighten folks in terms of some other information that you may want to consider before you go and make a radical shift to your diet. Chances are we all have the opportunity to always be improving our diet and adjusting to new information as it comes forth. But my goal with all of this is to try and help you guys to navigate the complexity of diet so that you can make a more informed choice and move forward with confidence. So hopefully that made sense. Welcome, Vita. Welcome, Frankie. Welcome, Kathy. Kathy had some great comments in the last live stream. So great to have you back, Kathy. And Sandy, welcome from Kelowna. And if you're just signing in right now, make sure you introduce yourself and let us know where you're coming in from. I will be just quickly doing a review of the last session, and then we will get into the new session. It's probably not going to be a long conversation today. We'll see how many comments you guys have. And by the way, I love your comments, so keep them coming. Introduce yourself to your fellow students, fellow people that are signing in to the live stream. And we're going to get started here right away. So I'm just going to get the slide set up here, and away we go. So the title of the talk was context-specific diets. And the reason that I used the word or the statement context specific diets is that there is no diet should basically be based on context. So where do you live? What does your bioregion produce? What's it really good at? What's it really bad at? And we started off kind of doing an overview last time, which is the 6-part series that we're going to talk about over the next coming weeks. And the first one, we introduced this concept of why we talk about diet. And then we're going to get in today into plants and nutrition. Number 3, we're going to talk about plants and energy. And I have this suspicion that the people that are signed in on this chat already know a lot about diet. So I welcome your comments and your feedback and any additional information that you put in here. It could potentially be a very interesting conversation if you guys are open to contributing with some additional comments. Next week, we're going to talk about plants and energy next Friday. The week after that, we're going to talk about specifically around context-specific diets. Number 5, we're going to talk about diets and ethics. That should be a very interesting conversation. And then lastly, I'm going to try and present another approach to looking at food after we've covered all of these topics. So I got this article, which is why we started talking about this. Meat eaters are destroying the planet, says report. And this article is completely false. At least its conclusions are false. I think that if it stated meat eaters that meat animals from confined animal feeding operations that are fed annual grains, that they're not actually, that are fed annual grains are destroying the planet. With a subtitle saying that BTW, and most animals that we raise on farms are not really designed to eat grain. So it's actually not the animals that are destroying the planet. It's the way the animals are being raised, and it's the annual agriculture. It's the production of grains that's actually destroying the planet. That's the issue here. And it's ironic that the article says meat eaters are destroying the planet, and then they've got a picture of annual agriculture, which is the real culprit. And we'll break all of this down for you guys, of planet destruction, not just the confined animal feeding operations. The whole thing is just a bunch of washing. It's greenwashing, it's whitewashing, it's washing. It's not accurate. So we'll break this down. So today I want to talk a little bit about plants and nutrition. And this is a recent book that came out, and I have scanned it. My mother-in-law has actually read it from cover to cover. My wife has read parts of it. My brother-in-law and his girlfriend have read it. And there's been a lot of conversation in our house around this book. And the premise is that plants are not actually all that healthy, or at least some plants are not all that healthy. And other plants that are typically considered to be healthy are not healthy in certain states. And so a lot of the conversation right now around vegetarianism and veganism is a conversation that involves kind of eliminating meat from the diet and eating an entirely plant-based diet. And so this is just not based in any kind of, we'll get into why that doesn't make sense for the majority of the planet. There are parts of the planet where this does make sense. And we'll talk about energy density and the amount of energy that goes into the production of vegetables and grains and things like that. But today I want to focus specifically on plants and nutrition, because I think it plays into the other things that we're going to talk about plants. And this is not something that people really talk about. And Stephen Gundry kind of slightly hits on this, but he comes at it mostly from the health perspective, as opposed to kind of looking at it from a more holistic perspective. So his whole take on plants, he looks at plants through the lens of lectins. I'm curious, has anybody heard of this compound, a lectin? So I'm just curious if you guys have heard of what lectins are. If you have any good resources other than this book on lectins, you can just put that up in the chat window. So he specifically comes at this from lectins. And if you think about plants are not like animals at all, because they don't have legs and they can't run away. And so every species on the planet has its own defense mechanism, essentially. And animals, one of their defense mechanisms, depending on if they're predator or prey, obviously is going to change. If they're a predator, they're going to have big teeth and they're going to be able to run after you or something and hunt you down. and eat you, versus if you're prey, you're going to probably be really good at camouflaging yourself. Maybe you've got poison somewhere on your body. Maybe you can run really quickly. Maybe you can climb trees. So every species has some sort of a defense mechanism. Well, plants don't have the ability that animals do. And so they've had to evolve differently. And one of the things that plants have developed is this concept of lectins. And lectins are essentially anti-nutrients. They're bad for you. And some of us are more sensitive to lectins than others. And so it's just kind of coming to the fore that a lot of the plants that are very heavily required in a vegan or vegetarian diet are lectin heavy. So things like legumes are very high in lectins. Lectins and plants that require ripening. So the tomato is actually on the front of the cover there. Tomatoes actually have a ton of lectins. And the thing that blew my mind with regards to lectins when I was reading through some of the stuff in this book was this idea that lectins and the amount of lectins in certain foods is directly proportional to when the plant was harvested. So what I mean by that is if a plant like a tomato, for example, which is going to be shipped halfway across the world, so you can have tomatoes 12 months of the year in Canada, which is not natural at all, means that the tomato grown in, let's say, South Africa or South America is picked before it is ripe so that it has a higher chance of actually shipping to its final destination, let's say Calgary. The amount of lectins in that food are dramatically higher when the food is not ripe than when it is ripe. So think about this for a second. Let's break this down. Let's talk about some of the global trends that we've been seeing as far as nutritional health in humans. So we see, Kathy actually mentioned, yes, lectins, leaky gut, etc. Yeah, there are other diseases, Kathy, that you're aware of that are directly proportional to lectins. I'd love for you to put it up into the chat window for others to see. But lectins have been linked to autoimmune disease, to leaky gut, as Kathy says, to a number of diseases. And hey, Kirk, how's it going? And so as our lectins, as we've, there's a phone there. Sorry, guys, that's going to make a bit of noise there. Let's see if I can turn that off. So as we have adopted industrial agriculture and kind of 24/7, 365-day food, that has meant that we have bred our plants to be a specific way. So they're basically able to be shipped as opposed to nutritionally dense, let's say. And it, you know, it's funny, just as an aside, my mother-in-law is in her 60s now. She can remember when the first grocery store came to her small town. It was like in the 50s. Grocery stores are a really new thing. And basically, before grocery stores, people had to grow their food or buy their food from local growers, preserve the food that they wanted to consume in the wintertime, and then eat it as it was available. And when that food was done, they ate what was left. So we've been eating less and less locally from the 1950s onwards. And it's gone up exponentially. And so what that basically translates to is that as we've developed new strains of vegetables and plants that can be shipped further and further around the world, we've likely selected plants that actually have higher lectins, either directly or indirectly, not to mention the fact that we're harvesting them when they're not ripe, which means that their lectin concentration is even higher. Now look back on the last 50, 60 years at the rise in autism, the rise in autoimmune diseases, the rise in leaky gut, celiac. All of these things correlate perfectly with a world that is eating further and further away from where we live. Now, I'm not saying that lectins are the only thing that's responsible for all of these problems. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is that as our industrial food system has removed humans from the production of food and removed us from the ability to eat locally, there have been all sorts of unintended consequences that have emerged in our foods that we're only just finding about right now. And lectins is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure that there are hundreds of other factors that we haven't even thought of investigating. I mean, there's a doctor in Hawaii right now that is investigating and found some very strong correlation between Roundup and celiac disease. And so as we've adopted desiccation practices, which is basically the spraying of Roundup onto our barley and our wheat and our canola right at the end of its life, before probably that grain is even ripe. And I can go into a little bit more detail if people aren't familiar with how grain is currently harvested. Basically, the desire for farmers to do this is an attempt to try and save some labor and some time, so, and also to get a better grain crop that's uniformly dried out, essentially all at the same time. So before, what would happen is the grain would naturally come to the end of its life. Once the end of its life was reached, they would watch for how dry the kernels were, and then they would go out and swath and harvest and combine it all at the same time. Now what they're doing is they're spraying these crops so that they uniformly dry standing, and standing grain dries better. And instead of grain that's being packed up into piles, and then they can just combine it right off the field. Well, I'm a baker originally. I grew up in a bakery, and I'm going to tell you something. When you bake whole wheat bread, that means that the kernel and the husk is still on the grain when you go and grind it. And what that means is that if you're buying grain or bread from a farm that has used desiccation practices, that husk is covered in Roundup, okay? And that gets ground up in the bakery. We don't wash whole wheat kernels before we grind it. It wouldn't grind otherwise. So we take the kernels from the farm or from the flour mill, which is usually the person or the company that is grinding the flour up, and they grind the kernel, they grind the husk, and they grind the Roundup on the husk, which then ends up in the bread. And so if you think that eating whole wheat bread that has been grown using desiccation practices is healthy, I've got news for you. You're probably better off, if you're going to eat non-organic bread, to eat white bread, because white bread is going to have less Roundup than whole grain bread. So my point here is that as we've adopted food practices that are further and further away from us, the nutritional concentration of these foods have gone down because of selection practices, because we're harvesting the plants when they're not ripe, because we're eating from further and further away. I mean, a lot of tomatoes that come in from overseas go into ethylene chambers in order to try and rapidly ripen them when they show up in the grocery store. And I could go on and on and on and on about this. And so my point here is that this whole myth about how veganism and vegetarianism is a better diet for northern climates, for climates basically north of, let's say, Arizona or even Texas, is a complete myth, because the only way that you can eat a vegetarian and vegan diet, there's only really two ways to do it. One is to grow an enormous garden, like an unbelievably large garden, and be really good at food preservation. So you have to preserve everything that's surplus out of your garden in a giant root cellar, and you're going to basically be eating out of cans as soon as the summer is gone for the rest of the year. That's one way. The other way to do it is to rely on shipping containers and ships and airplanes and ground transport to provide food to you from other places in the world where it's currently being grown underneath the sun. And the expense of that is that's going to mean that food is being picked when it's not ripe, which means the lectin concentration is higher, which means you're actually getting toxins into your body. Now, traditional societies have found ways and innovative ways to preserve food for long periods of time, reduce the lectins, and increase the nutritional concentration. One of those is plants like soy. So soy is generally not very good for you, and there's plenty of research to show that soy is actually pretty bad for you. However, there are ways to eat soy that can be quite healthful, and so things like tofu, miso, other long ferment type processes that take these lectins and these anti-nutrients that exist within things like soy, and they eliminate it through digestion, through microbiological processes. In Australia, this is an interesting fact. In Australia, 100 years ago, so Australia is a really interesting place. It has very old soils. Australia has never gone through a glaciation. And so the soils there are really depleted in zinc. And it's so bad that if you want to impregnate your wife, typically men have to go on either a zinc supplement or they have to eat oysters for a period of time in order to get their zinc levels up high enough to actually become fertile again. And so I'm not sure why this practice, I probably have an idea of why this practice has been stopped, but sometime in the last 100 years, this practice was stopped. And so the practice that I'm speaking about is that there was a law in Australia that said that bread had to be fermented for at least 24 hours before it could be baked and consumed. And the reason for that was that the yeast would actually change the structure of the flour such that the bread would not rob zinc out of the bodies of the people that consumed it. So bread that's under fermented actually robs zinc out of your body. So it's actually stealing nutrients from you as opposed to giving it to you. And I know this, again, because I'm a baker. I grew up in a bakery, that when you're trying to make money on a product that sells for $2 or $3, allowing it to ferment for 24 hours is not a profitable proposition. Another reason why you want, if you're going to eat bread, you're going to want to eat your own bread that you bake at home so that you can allow for a 24-hour ferment. And there's lots of great recipes out there on how to ferment bread for 24 hours. And once you've actually had bread that's been fermented for 24 hours, you're never going to go back. So a lot of the plants that we have consumed traditionally, the processes that have been used to produce those plant-based products, bread, miso, soy, canned tomatoes, we have adapted how we process these foods in order to try and make the food industry more profitable. And I can tell you again, because I'm from the food industry, that it is really hard to make money in the food industry. And so industrial food companies will do whatever they can to either speed the process up, fill commercial food products with filler, so that they can, or air even, so that they can make more money. And so my point with all of this stuff is that when you're living on an entirely plant-based diet, you're actually eating from an industrial system. It's very hard to grow all of your own food if you're only going to eat vegetables or plants. It may be able to be done depending on your ecosystem, but if you live up in the northern latitudes like I do, you've got to eat whatever your ecosystem produces. And that's going to be the most nutritious food that you can eat. So if we take your diet from a nutritional perspective, eat what your ecosystem produces 12 months of the year. If you live in the subtropics or in the tropics, I think that you could live entirely off of a vegan or vegetarian-based diet. But if you're living up where I live and a lot of you guys are calling in from, it's not a nutritional proposition. And when we get into some of the future slides that we're going to talk about, we'll talk about how it's not actually even an environmentally friendly proposition from an energy perspective. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about this too. There's this idea that somehow everybody talks about how bad these feedlots are, right? Because the animals are producing all this manure. And so it's easy for urbanites and people that are kind of disconnected from farms to think all of a sudden that manure is somehow bad. Okay. Or the other myth that I get is, it takes, I don't know, what is it, 100 liters of water to produce a pound of beef. Well, the thing is that that's a very simple soundbite, and it kind of instantly gets to the crux of what people think the problem is. But cows don't just drink water and it just kind of evaporates into space. Okay, so if a cow drinks 100 liters of water, 95 liters of that is going to end up back on the ground. Maybe even 99 liters of that will end up back on the ground. And that urine has fertilizer in it. And it is the byproduct of decomposition occurring in the multiple stomachs that exist in, sorry about that, guys. Got to get rid of this phone. So the nutrient ends up back into the landscape. And so the inefficiency of the cow, which is the primary argument against cows, represents the efficiency of the land. I'll say that again. The inefficiency of the cow represents the efficiency of the land. So the argument being used against cows is that they're so inefficient at producing food, they consume all this land, blah, 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 blah. But the thing is that as a cow eats, it defecates most of what it eats back onto the ground, which actually builds topsoil, sequesters carbon, and generally makes the ecosystem more productive. Whereas when you look at a vegetable, and I'll get to this nutrient density slide here in a second, when you look at a vegetable, when you pull a carrot out of the ground, that carrot is pulling 100% of what it accumulated out of the ground and is being shipped somewhere else on Earth. And so if you only produce vegetables on your farm and you have no animals or no livestock, and your job and your business is about producing vegetables and shipping them as far away as possible, you're not running a vegetable farm. You're running a mining operation. So all the vegetable farms that are basically existing in California, that are existing in Mexico, these are not farms, they're mines. And instead of using machines and humans as the main mining mechanism, they use vegetables. And if those farms are not partnering with animals, and there is not, and especially if it's in a place like California or Mexico, where you do not have enough moisture in the ecosystem to actually create the decomposition that's required to create nutrient-dense food, then there's only one way that they're getting nutrients into that soil. And it's synthetic fertilizer. And if it's not synthetic fertilizer, I don't know if you've noticed the trend, but a lot of our spinach and our lettuce has this marketing claim that the lettuce is triple washed. Now, there's two things that happen when your lettuce gets triple washed. Number one, it's as you triple wash lettuce, you're basically eliminating any of the beneficial microbes on the lettuce. Now, they're actually washing it that many times because there's pathogens on the lettuce. And if you are buying organic lettuce or spinach that's triple washed, then that is probably being fertilized with human excrement. I know that's disgusting, but that's the case. That's why so many people were getting sick from spinach and salad. So you're buying this organic product that's been triple washed because they don't want you to get fecal coliforms into your food. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as you triple wash it, not only do you take the pathogens away, but you take any of the beneficial microbes away. So most of the beneficial microbes that replenish the microbes in our gut actually come from eating raw vegetables. Okay, so raw vegetables are very important in our diet, but those raw vegetables should be coming from our ecosystem because they're going to have the microbes from our ecosystem to help us adapt to that ecosystem. So our microbiome is recharged based on the microbes that exist on the vegetables that grow right outside our back door, which is why eating carrots with soil from your garden is actually so good for you, because you're getting the benefit of the carrot, but you're also getting the benefit of the microbes that live in your soil, which is helping your body to bioregionally adapt to your ecosystem. So let's break this down a little bit. As our food has traveled further and it's being picked when it's not ripe, as we are creating mines that are basically mining the nutrients out of soil and replacing those nutrients with the macros, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, not the micros, and we're eliminating the animals by placing them into feedlots over here and growing and creating a huge fertilizer plume, which is creating dead zones, and our vegetable farms over here, where they used to be interconnected in mixed farms, the nutrient over here is a problem because it's not being applied properly at the right density to land. And the vegetables are a problem because now they're becoming a mining mechanism that's taking nutrients out of the soil, shipping it to other places on Earth. And because this synergy doesn't exist anymore, Thomas Pollock has written a book called The End of Food. And in his book, it's basically a treatise of all of the different foods that we consume on a daily basis and how they all have anywhere from 25 to 80% reduction in nutrient density. Now, you look at the rising disease rates over the last 50 years, and there is no coincidence to me. We have disconnected the animals from the land. We have replaced the nutrients and the micronutrients that those animals were helping to synthesize in a way that plants were able to utilize. And we are mining the soils from those locations, which means that there's no nutrients in them anyways. And so really all we're doing is shipping water that has a certain color or tinge and shape. Carrots, lettuce, broccoli, all around the planet. Folks, there's only one solution to this problem. Actually, there's 1.5 solutions. So the first solution is to buy products, specifically if you're living in an ecosystem where you can't grow vegetables year-round in a sustainable way, you need to eat meat. And hopefully that meat will come from farmers like Kirk, who's on this call right now. He lives in northern Alberta, who are using regenerative practices. So Kirk's byproduct is grass-fed beef. His primary product is actually carbon sequestration, water harvesting, improving the nutrient density of the land, improving ecological services so that we can breathe clean air. You need to eat to your ecosystem. That's where the most nutrient-dense food will come from, is directly outside your back door. The main solution, so you need to support the local farmers around you. So that's solution. That's the half solution. The additional solution to that, the one out of the 1.5, is you need to have a kitchen garden. You need to have a main crop garden, and you need to be consuming as much vegetables out of your own productive system as possible. This is what's going to be the best for your health, first and foremost. So your internal microbiome, it will improve 100% if you start eating vegetables right outside of your garden. The nutrient density will improve, so that'll improve the overall nutrition of your own body. And then in addition to that, you're not going to be using tons of fossil fuel to drive those vegetables all the way around the planet. And then lastly, you're not going to be contributing to confined animal feeding operations. You're not going to be contributing to mining operations. And in an ideal world, all of the surplus nutrient that we consume out of our garden goes right back into it. So this is for a whole other conversation, but when we actually look at the nutrient cycle of the earth, humans, for the first time in the last, let's say, 300 to 400 years, have a completely disconnected nutrient cycle. So we are defecating into drinking water. And so all that food that we're pulling out of our gardens, out of other people's gardens, out of industrial farms, is ending up into drinking water and getting shipped away down to the ocean. Those nutrients never come back. So for a future conversation, we'll talk about the importance of composting and composting toilets. That might take us another 100 years to adopt as a species, because we have such a fecophobic mentality. But if we're not talking about nutrients and nutrient cycling, then we will never, ever be sustainable, or more importantly, regenerative. And if we don't start returning these nutrients to the soil, the nutrient density of our food is going to continue to plummet. And this is a really big problem, because if you want to create a society of healthy, long-living humans, this is a keystone component to living or bringing up a healthy society. So the solution to nutrient density, the solution to the dead zones in the ocean, the solution to improving human nutrition is eating locally. And preferably that local food should come off of your own property. Now, if you live in a city, there's this great saying that Bill Mollison has, which always blows the socks off of everybody's feet when I say it. And he basically said that if you want to live in a city and you want to live on the most sustainable diet you possibly can, then you should actually eat a diet that consists 100% of grass-fed meats. And that always blows people's minds. And usually there's a bunch of people that argue against it. The reason that he's saying that, and he's not talking about confined animal feeding operation meats. He's talking about grass-fed, properly raised meats from mixed farms who are being raised, meats that are being raised by farmers that are basically using regenerative practices. Okay, so I'll just stipulate that right now. The reason that he says this comes back to that initial statement that I made a few minutes ago, which is that the inefficiency of the animal, which is what everybody's talking about and why everybody's saying that animals are destroying the world, or meat eaters who are raising these animals are destroying the world. The inefficiency of the animal represents the efficiency of the ecosystem. So, and there's another old saying that I'll just preface before I talk about this a little bit more, is that there's an old farmer saying that you should never sell anything off of your farm that can't walk off your farm. So what they're saying is that you should never sell carrots off your farm. You should never sell onions off of your farm. You should only sell things that can walk off of your farm: cows, pigs, chickens, excuse me. The reason they're saying that is that when you sell a carrot off your farm, you're actually selling valuable nutrients off of your farm. And those nutrients will never come back. As vegetable farmers, we don't ask our clients to send us back with night soil. That is a practice that used to be done in China, however. Chinese people would expect a deposit back into their system in the form of night soil if they were a vegetable farmer. That does not happen in North America. So the only solution to not having a cyclical night soil system back to vegetable farms is to grow your own vegetables right where you live. And if you're not willing to do that, then eat grass-fed, ethically raised animals, because the animals are only taking about 5 to 10% of what they eat off of the property. The rest of it stays behind. So hopefully that made sense. And this always shocks a lot of urbanites. And it's amazing how many times in a permaculture design course within the first 3 or 4 days that our students who have graciously and selflessly given up meat because they think they're doing a disservice to the planet go out and try and find ethically raised meat very shortly after. One, because it tastes great and their body is craving it. We need protein, we need fat. But number two is because they never actually realized and looked at the argument of how we should eat through a lens of entropy, which is really all I've been talking about today. It's the study of disorder. It's how systems cycle. It's how systems stay in flow for millennia. If we as a society move to 100% vegan or vegetarian diet, it's all over. It's all over. Okay, and I'm going to talk about other points that make this point even further in coming Fridays. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to open it up to conversation for you guys and for questions if you have any questions for me. While you guys are formulating your questions, I've put a little description of this conversation in the show notes below, so you can take a look at that. I linked to the article that I talked about in one of my other slides there, so you can go take a read of it for yourself. These articles are super dangerous. They're really, really dangerous, and we have got to speak up against them, because if we don't, we are in deep, deep trouble. So I will leave it at that. Actually, I just wanted to mention a couple other things in the show notes. We've got our free blog book. If you haven't downloaded it, you can get our free blog book, which is our take on permaculture. While I'm waiting for some questions to come up there, I just want to talk a little bit about permaculture. There's also a free e-course there that you can take on how to get permaculture into your life. It's basically an introduction to permaculture that you can take if you're interested in learning more about permaculture. I've been thinking about this for a long time with regards to what permaculture actually does for an individual. And at the essence of it, permaculture is about freedom. I know that sounds glib a little bit, but at the end of the day, you know, as our world gets more complex and more bureaucratic, and there's more regulation, and we struggle to get good nutrient-dense food, and our lives become more dependent on our water grid, on our power grid, on the industrial food system, all of these things that we've been told to depend on, these centralized systems that provide us with all of our needs. The more of these centralized systems that we depend on, some of them have been really beneficial to us. I'm not going to pretend like they've all been bad. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily get rid of the centralized systems. But what I'm saying is that as we rely more on centralized systems and we lose the skills of decentralization that we had 100, 200 years ago, we can clearly see that some of these centralized systems, like the food system, don't necessarily have our interests at hand, our best interests in mind, sorry, I should say. And so permaculture is about reskilling. It's about getting that freedom back so that you can start taking responsibility for your life, so that you can have a parallel system to the industrial food system, so that in the event that your system collapses or the industrial food system collapses, there's a secondary system. Food is too important not to have a secondary system. Same with the water systems. I just read an article just the other day that talks about how in the United States, the cost of grid-based water is going to go up at least 5-fold in the next half a decade to a decade. In Detroit, already a huge percentage of the population in Detroit have defaulted on their water bills. So our central systems are fragile. They're expensive to operate. They're expensive to maintain. And as they become less profitable to operate and the corporations just kind of walk away from them, all of a sudden we're left without food, without water, without power. And so permaculture itself is about freedom. It's about reclaiming your power and starting to reskill in all of these areas so that you can have parallel systems that will supply you in the event that these centralized systems no longer support you anymore. And as a result of that, we end up becoming more sustainable, we build more community, and we become more resilient. And that's what this is all about. That's why I'm on YouTube 3 times a week trying to talk about another way. So hopefully I'm getting that through to you guys. I'm very, very passionate about food, and definitely I'm going to go back into the show notes here and see if there's any questions that we can talk about in the talk here. So let's just go through some of these quotes. So Frankie says, the inefficiency of the cow represents the efficiency of the land. Absolutely. Kathy, the thing that bugs me most about vegans' anti-cow argument is the whole flatulence thing. Yeah, totally. Kathy, you raise a really good point. When you look at cows, the researchers, what they'll do is they'll put the cows into a concrete kind of enclosed airtight room, and they analyze how many farts basically these cows put out. And the thing is that a cow will never be in a situation where it's in a concrete room all by itself with a fart analyzer. It'll be out on the pasture if it's in a natural setting. And it turns out that there are actually, they're called methanomes. And so these are microbes that exist at the soil surface level, and they actually will decompose methane. They actually require methane in order to live. And so when we look at cows and flatulence, the most important thing to think about is the cow and the grass, the net result of these two species living together, is it a net sequestration element? Or is it actually putting more carbon into the ground than it's producing? Or is it producing more carbon than it's sequestering? And so when the cow is in a confined animal feeding operation, flatulence is a huge issue. But cows aren't meant to be in confined animal feeding operations, and they're not meant to be eating grain. As soon as you place the cow back into the ecosystem that it belongs, the flatulence argument disappears because it makes no sense whatsoever. If you go back to the last conversation that we had, when the bison were still roaming the plains before we put fences up, there were more bison on the plains when they were still here than there are cows in the world right now. Okay, so this whole argument is completely out of context. So thanks for bringing it up. Bender Lyserich, meat causes acidosis. Okay, so diverse perennial edible forest systems would provide superior nutrition compared to grazed desert monocultures we've established across most of the world. So I'm not going to deny that there are all sorts of things that can cause acidosis in a stomach, and if you eat anything out of balance, then you are definitely susceptible to acidosis. But if you look at doctors like Dr. Berg on YouTube, there's another doctor that I've been following from the Midwest, from the East Coast, Ann Arbor, I believe. It turns out that a ketogenic diet does the exact opposite. It actually reverses acidosis. And so meat is not necessarily the direct culprit of acidosis. Overconsumption of meat can be bad for you. No different than overconsumption of soy or overconsumption of anything. We need to look at the macros. And when we get to the third way, which is going to be in a few weeks from now, I'm going to talk about a more holistic way to look at diet that's not based in veganism. It's not based in carnivorism. It's not based in omnivorism. It's based in looking at systems through a physics, entropy, and a rational lens, saying, I'm going to leave it to that so you guys show up for the show. It's way less prescriptive than, like, the minute somebody says everybody on earth should be vegans, they don't understand science. They don't understand biology, and they don't understand ecology. They're missing some very, very important points. A healthy human should have the ability to transition through all of those diets depending on where they live and what time of season exists. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Meat is required for some, in some climates, I feel. However, the fixation and overindulgence in meat causes acidosis. It's to complete excess. Absolutely. Yeah. If you eat too much meat, then you're going to have issues for sure. But like I said, you can eat too much of anything. I think you mean desertification reveals plant-based protein is not only adequate, but desertation. I'm not sure what you're saying there, Bender. It's not necessarily superior, and it's definitely not adequate. And if you look at plants from the nutrient transport and the mining function of those plants, if you want to lead a vegan life living in Calgary, you need to grow all of your own food in your backyard, and you need to be using a composting toilet, and you need to be acting as the cow. If you're not willing to consume a cow in this ecosystem, then you have to be that cow. Which means that you need to return that manure back to your own ecosystem. Otherwise, you're not sustainable. You're not regenerative. You're just contributing to the problem. You're actually mining the soil. And if you're requiring vegetables and plants from other ecosystems, it's even worse. Laura's beef, grass-fed in the Midwest. Okay, perfect. Sandy Hardman. Kirk Howell, what is your company's name and brand? I will try and find Kirk's company if he's not still on the conversation, so that you guys have access to that, maybe towards the end of the call here. Frankie Robertson, Bender, Lysergic, how long have you been a vegan/vegetarian? Vita, industrial farming has ruined our diversity. We're trying to source Guernsey milk cow, and we can't find it at all. Guess they didn't fit into the industrial milk system. No, they didn't. Bender, about 4 to 3 years, I'd say, not strict either. Frankie, okay. Bender, what region are you from? Kathy, what's the best way to approach this with a vegan/vegetarian, well-intentioned as they are, to get them to at least question their belief system? Kathy, I don't know the answer to that question, because I really do believe that when the student is ready, the teacher will show up. And so because diet is such a sensitive topic, they really have to be receptive to actually having a conversation that's two-way about diet before you can really have that conversation. And honestly, my own experience has been that when I have people showing up at my programs that have a specific dietary regime, and I take them through this process in our permaculture design course, they usually there's usually one of two types. So there's vegetarians that have done it and they've made the sacrifice, but they really do enjoy meat, and they don't necessarily have the context that I'm trying to provide to you guys right now. And so when they get that context, they look at things through a different lens. And so they're ready to transition. And then there's other people that have made dietary choices who are so convinced in their mind that the choices that they've made are correct, that no amount of conversation is going to change their mind. So I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince people of things that they're not ready to be convinced of. And realistically, I'm not really trying to convince anybody of anything. What I'm trying to do in this conversation is say, we have to be very careful about prescribing extreme diets that are not context specific. So my honest approach to diet is that I'm a vegan, I'm a vegetarian, I'm an omnivore, and I'm a carnivore. And it all depends on which part of the season I'm eating in. My body consumes as much as I can what my ecosystem produces. That's my diet. And so I don't know how anybody can fault me for that. That's what is most regenerative, and that's what's most sustainable. And those are my biases. So I guess if the person you're talking to is doing so to be regenerative and sustainable, then the best way to approach it is to ask them questions. Why do you think your particular diet is sustainable? Where does the nutrient come from? How is the nutrient getting back onto the property? Are you providing human manure or your excrement back to the farmer who's growing your food? And you just kind of start asking questions instead of telling them how they should or shouldn't be. Questions is a far more appropriate way of getting to the root of the opportunity or the root of the problem. Vita, LOL, I was born with a peanut allergy and that took vegan right out of my life. Right. Bender, Vita, B, correlation doesn't mean causation. Bender's absolutely correct. Correlation and causation are two totally different things. Kathy says, sorry. Kathy says, I tried vegetarian for a while and was constantly coming down with colds every couple of months. That's an interesting observation. I agree with you, Rob. I was vegan in Texas. However, after relocating to Michigan, finding that it's hard to maintain this system in a concrete jungle. Totally. Bender, well, since I went vegetarian, I've rid myself of chronic asthma, excess weight, and allergies. So coming back to your point, though, Bender, is that causation and correlation are two separate things. So you might be noticing a change through this adoption of more vegetables, but it might be an indirect cause of actually taking out other things that you are consuming. So instead of it being because you only eat vegetables, it might be something that that you were unaware of that was actually causing those issues. So it's not necessarily becoming vegetarian. For example, you might have dealt with a deficiency in your microbiome. So it's not the lack of meat that has caused that. It's the increased amount of insoluble fiber that's feeding the microbiome in your gut, which has then made your immune system stronger. So it's easy to say, well, it's vegetarianism, but it could be actually other factors as well. Frankie, the first vegetarian I met didn't like I didn't like her because she smoked. Yeah, so I mean, that's just a personal thing. I mean, we all make life decisions about what's good and what's not good for us. Bender, overall stamina is better. Just as you can be a meat eater incorrectly, you can also be a vegetarian or veggie poorly. Absolutely. But we're talking about what's sustainable and regenerative here. And so if you live in a certain ecosystem where that's sustainable and regenerative, all the power to you. That's what this conversation is all about. Everybody reacts differently. Okay, so Frankie, Oprah taught me years ago, if you're going to consume meat, make sure it's regenerative practices, meaning a cow should only be eating grass. Absolutely. Frankie, okay, and then Vita. Okay, Bender, taking heed. Vita, when my father-in-law was in the last part of cancer, the docs told him to go off sugar to get the acid levels down in his gut. Yeah, sugar actually causes all sorts of problems. I think sugar is one of the biggest culprits and one of the largest causes of health. Turns out with cancer, cancer cells have dysfunctional mitochondria cells. So when you fast and you stop eating sugar, the cancer cells no longer have a food source. So fasting and going into a ketogenic diet, which is high in the fat department, low protein, high insoluble fiber, will kill cancer. They're now starting to call cancer a disease of metabolism. Oh, Kirk, your website's not able to be posted on YouTube. They're very strict about what URLs go up. So if you just text me your website, I'll make sure that it goes into the show notes, okay? So just send me a text message to my cell phone. Okay, Frankie Robertson, you have definitively gave me something to think about and it's making sense. Awesome. YouTube Glick. Josh, sorry, this chat window goes all over the place. Web addresses not compatible with chat. Yeah. Kirk, just put a space in between a couple of letters so you can't see it as a website. Frankie, in which makes sense part of the less season your consumption is. Totally. Bender, it's ultimately about nutrient cycling. Are you building soil by season? The microbes ultimately are the animals in the system. And if you haven't got macro scale animals to do it for you. Sure. Bender says again, nature has phases of abundance, like a forest edge provides surpluses. If we tap into these surpluses, we can afford to transport some organic matter from the site sustainably. Sure. But again, you're bringing the point up. We've got to think about nutrient cycling. That is absolutely crucial in the way that we design these systems and our diets. TFT Web, we've been a vegetarian for about a year. I feel a lot better and I appreciate the lower environmental footprint. So again, I'm not sure if you've watched the whole show, TFT Web, but a vegetarian diet is not necessarily a lower environmental footprint. And I want to make a point here about footprints. We're almost out of time, but this is an important point. In the news, you guys have all heard this, and whether you've heard these specific words, you've definitely felt it inside. Okay, and what you felt is that this idea that is described in newspapers, on Facebook, on YouTube, everything you read or see. And the statement that is coming across loud and clear to you without anybody ever putting it into words is that humans are inherently destructive. Okay, this concept of a footprint is a perfect example of it. And the thing with all of this media is that nowhere in the media does it talk about how humans can be just as positive as they are negative. In fact, the best that we get is that at best, humans can be less destructive or they can be less bad. Now let's break that down a little bit. If that's actually true, if all we can do is be less bad, then we're actually not of this ecosystem. We're alien. We are transported here by some spacefaring species of former humans or something, and we've been placed on this earth and we're not native to this planet somehow. So if you think that's complete BS, I agree with you. It is complete BS because we are of this earth. We were born of this earth. And if we're born of this earth, then we actually have a role to play within the ecosystem. We have a niche to fill. So if you believe that, then all of this stuff, how we build our houses, how we eat our food, what type of food we eat, how we make our money, how we build community, how we harvest rainwater, everything that we do can be optimized. And if it can be optimized, it can be made to be in such a way that we can be just as positive as we are negative. So if the most negative thing on the earth is the nuclear bomb, then what's the most positive? This is the essence of permaculture. Permaculture is about creating relationships and systems that surround us as humans to make us just as positive as we are negative. So we can have our carrots and eat them too, and know that all the other species around us are able to thrive and survive within our ecosystem. And so it's not just about how many forests and fields we can plow under so that we can grow vegetables for the entire world, which is really what we're talking about. Vegetable farms are not biodiverse ecosystems. They're monocultures. The only vegetable production that is sustainable is on a really small scale in urban farms and in backyards and in the home sites or home yards of farms, period. Vegetarianism can be a positive diet if you live in a subtropical or tropical ecosystem where you can eat plants, vegetables, fruits, nuts year round. But if you're not in that type of an ecosystem, then it's not about being less bad, it's about being positive in general. And being positive means eating within your ecosystem, which means you eat as your ecosystem produces and what it produces. Okay, so rule of thumb is that carbs feed cancer. Absolutely. Right, we get it, Rob. I was just being comical. Yes, it was around that time that I got Jeff Lawton's farm and started eating nutrient-dense food. So again, nutrient-dense food is what matters. Absolutely. Okay. Kathy says, I've been low carb. So yeah, Bender, sorry, if you live in Northwest Central Tablelands currently, you probably can eat a vegetarian diet in your ecosystem. You live in a very warm climate. Kathy Partridge, I've been low carb paleo for almost 2 years. I've lost 60 pounds. Brain fog is gone. Medical numbers are excellent. Totally. I agree. I'm in the same place. TFT Web, great points. Frankie, awesome. Kathy Partridge. Tomas, space is fake. Okay. Marcus Havlin, eating potatoes makes me feel guilty. Well, you know, Marcus, it's all about how you grow them. So if you can find a way that you can grow, like tillage comes down to scale. So I think that some tillage can be used in your backyard garden if it's done appropriately. The problem is that when we get onto large tracts of land and we're using tillage, it can be inappropriate. There are places in large tracts of land where some tillage can be actually very beneficial. So again, we don't want to come at this from dogma. We want to look at all the facts and all the options and all the possibilities. So that pretty much concludes our time for today. I'm just going to put Kirk's website up here. It's ksfarm.org, and you can go to that on Google. So if you're in Alberta and you're looking for some incredible products, I actually have Kirk's beef in my freezer right now. He's bringing me a lamb shortly, and he's an incredible farmer up in the Peace region, one of the most pristine areas of Canada left. And if you're in Alberta, I highly recommend getting in touch with him. Hopefully you guys got a few things out of today's talk. We'll be back next Monday at 12 o'clock for another show. I'll announce all of the topics for next week on my website in the video section. You can check that out. I'll also be sending out an email to my list on Friday. I want to make one last mention to everybody on the list. Next week on Wednesday, so if you're on my list, you'll find out about this. I'm doing an exclusive webinar on passive solar greenhouse design with Curtis Stone, and we're going to be talking about how to make money in your backyard or on your farm, on your zone 1, growing microgreens. Curtis has the ability to grow upwards of $300,000 a year out of his 900 square foot passive solar greenhouse. And so him and I are going to be talking about the 9-step process to designing your own passive solar greenhouse in an exclusive webinar. I'm going to be announcing that on my list, as well as the videos I'm going to be talking about next week on Sunday. So if you're not on the list, you'll want to check that out. You can sign up below by going to the link that talks about our blog book. So get our free blog book and join our newsletter just by clicking on that link. If you're interested, make sure you get on the newsletter. It's going to be a great webinar. It's not going to be live on YouTube, so you'll want to sign up for that and tell all your friends as well. We're launching a brand new passive solar greenhouse course. I'm really excited about it. I've been working on it for the last 3 months. It's absolutely incredible, and hopefully I see you guys on the webinar itself. So looking forward to seeing you guys. We'll see you on Monday next week. Thanks so much for signing in today, guys. If you haven't hit the like button below, please do me a favor and hit that. It's really helps the channel to track. And if this video resonated with you, please feel free to share it on social media as well. Okay, guys, thanks so much. Have a great day. We'll talk to you guys all real soon.